Okay, let's get started. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Steve Lewis, and I'm a Senior Director of Risk Tech based in the UK. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to this Risk Tech webinar. This is the third of what is the fifth series we've run since May last year. Now, we actually asked you during the last webinar series as to what topics you'd like us to cover in this fifth series. And we listened, and as a result, we're going to be presenting on the 8 most popular requests. Now, one of those topics is the subject of today's webinar, which is about HAZOP leadership. I'm looking forward to this one, and I hope you are too. It should be pretty enjoyable, and hopefully you get some useful and practical insights as well. You also requested that the webinar should be slightly longer to cover a bit more detail, and therefore we've extended them to take an hour. So we'll have about 45 minutes for the presentation itself, and then about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. What we have done is we muted everybody, so the sound won't be distorted by any background noise. If you'd like to ask questions, and we really do encourage you to ask questions, so we have a full and complete Q&A at the end, then just use that Q&A function with Zoom. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You just drag your mouse down to the strip that comes up at the bottom and click on the Q&A, just type your question in. I'll keep track of them, and then we'll cover hopefully all of them within the time and within the hour we've got available. Okay, I'd now like to briefly introduce Risk Tech to you. Very quickly, because I think a number of you will have seen this quite a few times before. All we do really is help clients to manage health, safety, security, environmental and business risk in sectors where the impact of loss is high. We do that through a number of business lines, a range of specialist risk management consulting services. We also provide online and classroom training and postgraduate education. We also provide associates who work at client locations if there are any resource or skill shortages there. We also undertake industrial inspections in support of asset integrity management services. And we also undertake research and development in the field of risk and safety. Okay, I'd now like to present our speaker today, Mark Taylor. Mark actually presented at the last series when he presented on chronic unease as being a sort of missing ingredient in safety management. So hopefully you enjoyed that one. If you did listen to it, if you didn't listen to it, go back and have a listen to it. We will be able to give you access to that. So anyway, quickly, Mark has over 35 years experience in the oil, gas and process industries. He's a principal consultant based in our Aberdeen office in the UK. He's a fellow of the UK Institute of Chemical Engineers. He's also a professional process safety engineer. He actually comes from a background originally in managing complex R&D and engineering projects. He also has extensive experience in managing and delivering safety risk projects, and they include, of course, HAZOP leadership, safety case, hazard asset integrity management strategies, and he also does a ton of training as well. Okay, so over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome everybody, wherever you are. Thank you for coming along to the webinar. So today's webinar is about HAZOP leadership. Who, what, how, and where. What I want to do is just give a brief introduction to HAZOP. The webinar is not about the actual process of HAZOP itself. It's about the role of the leader of the HAZOP or the chair, and how the chair has to interact with the HAZOP team. But I think it's important we set the scene by giving you some background very briefly about what HAZOPs are, why and when it's done. So there are different definitions of what a hazard and operability study is. The one on the screen is from the IEC standard. Talks about operations and maintenance of the system, potential operability problems, and things like that. You'll notice in this definition, it doesn't really talk about safety. one of the things that's happened over the last 30 years I've been doing HAZOPs is it's moved away from the focus on operability issues to a focus on safety. But my mind of thinking is that really, if you focus on the operability, you will cover the safety issues. But one of the side effects of this move has been that often priority is not given to operability issues. For example, if an action is raised. And this is one thing that HAZOP leaders, HAZOP teams need to think about as they actually run HAZOPs. There's some other definitions. The one at the top is from Wikipedia. The one I actually prefer is from Lichu. It says HAZOP is a technique for identifying potential hazards and operability problems. Again, this one highlights the operability side of it. Obviously the hazards are there, but it's focusing on operability. And then the key thing is you're looking at the deviations from design intent. So what can go wrong with the system? Why will it fail to do what you expect it to do? Can the HAZOP team identify ways of failure which aren't obvious? And in fact, what you're trying to do is to break the design on paper, find a fault with it on paper so you can rectify it so that fault won't happen in the field, in the plant itself. That's really the important role of HAZOP teams, is to focus on challenging the design. So here's a classic example from the 1970s of what can go wrong of a system which doesn't work as expected. Now, during the 1960s and 1970s in the UK, chemical process plants were becoming more complicated. They were growing in size, significantly in size. They were moving away from manual control towards more automated control systems. DCS systems were becoming more capable. You were beginning to able to log data, and information systems were beginning to come to the fore. So this was a time of rapid change. The aim was to try and down man, to reduce manning. If you can reduce the manning, you can reduce the exposure of people to the risk. You're probably all familiar with Flixbus, or you might have heard about it. Okay, this was a chemical plant in England, which on a Saturday in 1974, there was an incident and the plant effectively blew up. There was a vapor cloud explosion. It killed 28 people. But that was lucky. And the reason it was lucky is because it occurred on a weekend. If it had occurred midweek, there would have been about 400 people, 500 people on site in the surroundings, and the vast majority of those people would have been killed. This incident occurred because of a simple change to the plant. It was done with the best intention. There was a fault in one of the reactors, and the engineers on site tried to bypass that reactor. They didn't have the formal management change processes we have now. They didn't do a HAZOP. They didn't look at the change. They thought it will be fine. It will be okay. What could go wrong? Fundamental to some of the issues they had is the philosophy of the way the plants were designed at the time. Again, this wasn't down to Flixbus itself. This was the common way of designing plants. So, for example, you would have a control room, and often that control room would be, the control room would often be in the middle of the process plant. Okay, that's so that the operator could see what was going on. And these days, that sounds ridiculous. Why would you want to see what's going on? In those days, that was what was considered to be common sense. You would see what's going on. You'd have it near the laboratory. Again, that would be heavily manned, and the laboratory would be in the center of the facility. There would be no discussion about whether that was a good idea or a bad idea. It would be done. And one of the first process plants I worked in, we had almost an identical arrangement. We had a control room in the center of the facility, and the original laboratory space was also in the central facility. While I was there, it was actually moved, but our offices were very close to the middle of the facility itself. Okay, so as time has moved on, although the HAZOP process was available then, it slowly became adopted. And there was an important paper issued by the CIA, not the American CIA, it's Chemical Industries Association, which really heavily promoted the use of HAZOPs within the chemical industry. And that's when they really became quite important. And then they got adopted by the oil and gas industry, particularly in the UK, offshore, and over time it spread around the world. You may know it as PHA, but HAZOP is a particular way of analyzing the design of a system. When you do it, actually you can do HAZOP pretty well any time in the life cycle of a project. You can do HAZOPs, very simple ones like concept design. That's related to the concept of inherently safer design. Do it very early on, see what could go wrong. Test the design. More normal is you do it at the front end engineering design, the feed stage, or the detailed design stage. But you can equally do it during pre-commissioning, just before you start operations. HAZOPs are often repeated every 5 years, so that you will do them post-operations, or you can do them when you're doing changes to operations. And also you can do it when you're repurposing equipment. So there's lots of times, lots of bites of the cherry when you can do HAZOPs. Now, although they're following the same principle, what the HAZOP team is being asked to do is slightly different. The same rules are applied, but the way you do it, what you're looking for is different. Okay. Who does it? Well, normally it's engineering contractors. It can often be operations. Technical and process safety are often given the role of organizing HAZOPs, but it's not really their responsibility. It should lie with the design people and the operations people, not with the tech safety or process safety people. And I think that's really important. And it comes back to the team bit, which I'm going to talk about later on in the talk. So people say HAZOPs are difficult. Why? Why are HAZOPs difficult? It's common sense, isn't it? You know, common engineering sense. You can look at the design, you can see what's wrong. It really shouldn't take a lot of time. Why do people spend days, weeks, even months running HAZOPs? What's all this time being used for? The problem is, this idea of common sense really doesn't exist. It's a figment. I mean, our own brains, the way we think, we generate a lot of the information that we actually see. We don't rely on our senses to get that information. For example, when you look at something and you look to the side, you see color. But in fact, that color's not really there because our eyes don't function like that. We have central color vision. We don't have peripheral color vision, except as far as the brain is concerned, we see the color. We see objects differently to what they really are in the world. We interpret information. We're very good at that. We look for patterns, but we're not actually seeing what's there. And so the purpose of the HAZOP and the reasoning for the formal structure is to get people to see what's actually there, not to rely on their own internal conception of what's there. H. Lawrence describes it like this: what the eye doesn't see and the mind doesn't know doesn't exist. Okay, it's basically trying to say you need to see stuff and you need to interpret it the correct way. In other words, you're challenging what you see. So that's the fundamental thing about HAZOPs. You're challenging the design. Okay. I'm going to pull up a slide. I'm sure you've all seen this picture of this dress. So before I go on, I'm going to ask Alina to put up a questionnaire. I'd like everybody at the seminar just to put up in the question whether they see the dress is black and blue, gold and white, or something else. We'll just let that run for a minute and then we'll get the results. So if you could just answer what you see. It doesn't matter if you've seen this before, because you'll still probably see the way you used to see it. You may be wondering why I'm asking you to do this. So when we see the results in a few, in about 10 seconds time, I'll stop the running and I'll ask Alina to put up the results and we'll see what happens. Okay, so you're all looking at the same information. Okay, half of you see the dress as black and blue. About a third of you see it as gold and white, and there's a residual who see it something different. Now, I'll be honest, I always see it as gold and white. And when people first showed it to me and said it was black and blue, I couldn't see it. And it doesn't really matter that I know it's black and blue, and I've seen other photos of it that's black and blue. I can't see it that way. And this is really important to understand the way the HAZOP process works. The reason it's involved a team is because you're trying to come to a consensus on what you're actually seeing. What does that design actually do? Okay. The dress is an illustration of that issue. Same information, everybody has the same information in front of you. I didn't preload up the information for you, and yet you've come to a different conclusion about what you're seeing. Oops. Next slide. Right. So, as I said, involve teams. So, there's three parts of the team, really, in general. There's sometimes a fourth, which I'll mention. There's what we call the independent HAZOP chair and the scribe. Okay, so that's the leader of the HAZOP and the scribe, who they should be familiar and they should have worked together. Sometimes it's referred to as a facilitator. I said I like the chair word because it gives some formality to the process. Often there'll be a contractor or contractors or even subcontractors there with a project team, and they normally have process or tech safety there. They'll have somebody who's leading their side of the HAZOP. And then you have the client, which will often be led by operations. They're going to receive the design and operate the design. And they will be backed up by their own project team and also technical safety of some sort. So this group of people are going to come together to examine a design. But again, they're not all coming from the same perspective. Okay, they don't see everything the same way, even though they're all engineers and they all know they want to get on with the job and produce a safe design and efficient design. So the chair associated with the scribe comes in and wants to get a robust process with regards to safety and operations. But the chair may not know everybody in the meeting room. Okay, in fact, it may know very few people in the meeting room. It may not even be thoroughly familiar with the process either. Brought in as an expert in leading the meeting, not brought in as a technical expert. The client definitely wants a safe and efficient design, no doubt about that. They also want it delivered on time, and they don't want it at extra cost. Okay, so they're looking at actions coming out the HAZOP, and they're thinking about, well, that's fine, that's all on the contractor. They have to solve that. The contractor comes in there, is also looking at design, and it's often their design, not always, but it's often their design. And they also want to deliver it, but they really don't want to be given any extra costs. They don't want to pick up the actions. Now, this isn't at the forefront of their minds. They're not saying this in the meeting, but it's there. It's like that dress. It's one person seeing it as blue and black, and the other one is seeing it as silver and white. Okay, gold and white. The same information, but they're looking at it from a slightly different point of view. That inevitably will drive behaviors and will drive how people think sometimes. Related to this idea of you get different perspectives within the team is that HAZOP teams are really unusual. It's not common in business, in industry, that you have a meeting which can last for weeks on end. That's exactly what you're asking to happen in a HAZOP. HAZOP can be anything from half a day to weeks, even months. They can go on for a long time with the core HAZOP team running all that time. So effectively, this HAZOP is a new team being formed. It's not a meeting which comes together for a short period of time. It actually will have a way of thinking of itself once it becomes established. Bruce Tucker, again in the 60s, came up with this wonderful phrase of forming, storming, norming, and performing. And this is the way he pictured that teams come together. It applies to all teams, but it really does apply to HAZOP teams. Now, those of you who've been to HAZOPs or been to any meetings where a new team is forming know that the initial stage, the forming stage, is when you get to know people you've never met, you shake their hands, you say hello, you don't know their strengths and their weaknesses, you really don't understand the dynamics, but you're beginning to get together. Okay, that's the forming stage. And normally in a HAZOP meeting, it's done through the introductions when you go around the table and you introduce everybody and everybody says very briefly who they are, what they do. But at that stage, you really don't know in any detail what the skill sets are. Okay, and then the HAZOP will start. At this stage, you go into this phase called the storming phase. This is where the boundaries, the way the team behave, starts to get together, and there's often a lot of discussion, argument. It can be quite noisy as people try to understand each other. And at this stage, the team is trying to work out how it should behave as a group of people. Sometimes storming lasts short time, sometimes it lasts a long time. But I'm sure you're familiar with going into meetings where you suddenly think, this meeting is a bit chaotic. What's going on here? Why are people behaving like that? And it's quite normal. It's what happens when teams form. Once you get through the storming phase, you come to this process of norming, where you actually start to feel comfortable within the team. A team starts to get on with the job. It recognizes how it's going to do the job. It recognizes the chair is going to lead them through the process, and it recognizes the different skill sets that different people have. It also identifies people who aren't so comfortable in the HAZOP team and who may need to be encouraged to participate. Once you get through that stage, you start to perform. And the key clue in performing is the HAZOP starts to feel like it's moving and making progress. People tend to relax and they actually start to, in a strange way, enjoy the HAZOP. There's jokes, there's chit chat. It becomes a far more pleasant environment to be in. The problem with HAZOPs is you need to get through those stages to the performing stage as fast as you can. Now, you're all probably familiar with the first day of a HAZOP. It's usually really hard work. You never achieve what you thought you were going to achieve. You're struggling to understand. Now, part of that is due to the sheer amount of information that you're trying to take in. But the other side of it, which you're not always aware of, is that the team is trying to get through this forming, storming, norming, and performing process. And the first day is really all about forming and storming. You get to norming, you're doing very well. And if you get to performing, you're doing brilliantly. Okay, so there's really this process which you need to be aware of, not only as a team, but particularly as a chair. You need to help the team get through this process. Sometimes HAZOP teams get stuck. And you've probably been in HAZOPs where this has happened. And there can be a lot of conflict, as I've already said. Some people will want to try and redesign the system. Some people might question the HAZOP chair's credentials. People talk over each other. Again, this is what happens, and you can recognize it and you can see it. It's not to be taken personally. I know that sounds odd, but it isn't. It's this process that all people go through in teams. They go through that to get the team into a system where it can start to perform. Okay, you just need to be prepared for it. It can be a bit disconcerting sometimes when it happens. Most of these examples are examples that have happened to me. So these are based on real HAZOP examples, what goes on sometimes in the storming phase. You get the storming phase and you get through norming, quite quickly moves to performing. And this is as the image implies, as I said, it's when people start to enjoy it, they relax. And you can feel as a chair that things are beginning to make progress and you're okay. You're going to make up the lost time that you might have suffered, and you believe that you're going to get cooperation from the team to actually deliver the HAZOP. So what's the chair's role in all of this process? Well, there's three main functions that a chair does. There's the pre-meeting preparation. There's running the meeting, and I'll talk more about both of these later on, and there's reporting. Really, the chair is the classic duck, really. On the surface, it's all calm. But underneath, if you looked at the legs, it's working furiously to try and keep everything on track. The chair is the only person who never really relaxes in a HAZOP. Even in the performing stage, the chair is always trying to think, what's going on? Have we missed anything? Have we got the right information? Have I asked the right questions? Have I had the right questions from the right people in the team? So trying to see and make sure that the information being gathered is the right information, is interpreted correctly. People aren't just relying on their first thoughts. They're aware that it might be blue and black, it might be white and gold. They're able to understand that different people have different views, and it's moving on. So that's the role of the chair, trying to gather this information together and trying to build a consensus about what's actually there. Chair has this role of the pre-meeting prep. There's generally never enough time for pre-meeting preps, mostly because people don't understand that what the chair is trying to do. They need to understand the subject. They're not going to be experts in the subject, but they need to understand the subject. They need to understand the fundamentals of the design and the design objectives. The chair should always develop the nodes. It's really important the chair does this because it helps the chair understand the objectives. It's a fundamental way of looking at drawings, say, yeah, I can understand the flow paths. I can understand the control strategy. I can understand this, I can understand that. And I've got some questions to ask about it. It helps the chair if a lead process engineer, a lead design engineer can help him understand that. But again, time is often against that process. Sometimes the chair will be involved in preparing the terms of reference of the HAZOP, if the HAZOP has one. Sometimes they're not. They'll often want to influence the keywords, the guide words, the more flow, the less flow. But these days, many companies have standards, and those keywords, those guide words are used from those standards. One of the issues I have with that is often these keywords have expanded over time. So they don't stick to the core of what a HAZOP's about, but they involve other issues more related to hazard or some other processes, which really shouldn't belong in a HAZOP. So you have to be careful about expanding keywords. Remember, you're challenging the design in terms of its operability. That's the focus of the HAZOP, and that's what the HAZOP chair is there to do. You sometimes get involved in preparing a timetable. There's rules of thumbs about how much time you need to run for a HAZOP, and you can do that based on the number of P&IDs. Very difficult to judge sometimes, and again, it relies on the skill of the HAZOP chair to actually say, yeah, we can do it in X amount of time. Generally, it's better to plan for more time and finish early than the other way around. You don't always get it right, though. It's very unusual that the chair is able to select the HAZOP team. It's very, very unusual these days. And it's also pretty unusual these days for the chair to actually specify the time and the location of the HAZOP. All of these things are what you would read in the literature about what a chair should do. Some of them actually don't happen like that. Clearly, after the last year and a half, the world's changed a lot. Traditionally, HAZOPs were round the table, team of people would come together, come to a building, go to a meeting room. Sometimes the room was large, sometimes it was small, sometimes it had good IT, sometimes it had bad IT. But generally, you sat around a table, you put the P&IDs out in front of you, or stuck them on the wall, and you would go through the process. Numbers of people will be limited, but there's really good opportunity for people to talk to each other, not only during the HAZOP itself, but at the breaks. We moved away from that very quickly to the online world, where face-to-face really doesn't happen. It's face to a round circle, or as I'm doing now, I'm talking to people. I can't hear you, I can't see you, I can't tell if you're falling asleep, whether interested or not. Very difficult to interact in that sort of environment. The other thing that happens in online hazards is people come into the meeting and drop out of the meeting. They're busy, so they may be doing other things. Around the table, it's easier to control that as a hazard chair. You can ask people to shut their computer. You can ask people to turn off their phone. You can ask them to go outside if they have to do something urgently. You really have no control about that online at all. And that can be disconcerting because you may be asking somebody a question and it goes quiet and you're not quite sure whether the person's not heard you, they've dropped out because the internet has fallen through, or actually they're doing something different and they're not actually engaged in the process at all. Okay. The other thing that's happened is hazards online tend to have hosts, casts of thousands seem to turn up. I've been to hazards over the last year and a half, where over 40 or 50 people have turned up to the hazard. I have no idea why most of those people were there. Most of them didn't participate. In fact, the core online tends to be smaller than round the table. Typically, I find that you get 3 or 4 people are the key who tend to contribute the most. Then there's an outer ring of people, 3 or 4, who chip in really useful stuff, but they don't participate an awful lot to the hazard. And the rest of the people don't really say very much. It's very difficult to engage those people because all you see is their initials, a list. You don't really know who they are. So it's difficult to know what to ask them. Face to face, that's very different. You can go around the table. You can walk up to people. You can ask people. It used to be traditional that you used to put people's names up on a card in front of their desk so you could remember who they were, or you'd write it up on a piece of paper in front of you with the people's names so you remembered who was who around the table, and you could actually engage with them and talk to them. And not only that, is you could talk to them during the lunch breaks, during the coffee breaks. Again, online, people go away from the coffee break. They don't engage in conversation. They don't engage in conversation about football. They don't engage in conversation about the weather, and they certainly don't engage in conversation about the hazard or the design. And that is a real deficit to the online process. You lose that introduction. And finally, I think what happens is around a table, you have time to think. You have the space to think. You can actually call a break in a HAZOP and break the team up to go away and have a think about things and then come back together. That's not so easy online. It's very difficult to get people to think because they're under pressure. They're trying to resolve issues. One role which is very important, which isn't the HAZOP chair's role, but it's worth mentioning, is the thing called a HAZOP host. It's not the chair, it's the person in a traditional HAZOP who calls the meeting, books the meeting room, the person you go to when you turn up to the building, sets the time and location. He'll often do the welcome talk at the beginning of the HAZOP, and he'll often do the safety moment. Tell you about where the toilets are, where the emergency exits are, that type of thing. Okay, that's the host's job. That's not the chair's job. Normally the host will introduce the chair. Online, that role still exists, but it's compressed, especially with hazards having lots of people. Sometimes you don't even do the introduction these days. It's just assumed that there's a list of names and you'll get on with it. The host has a more difficult job to keep everything going and set the meeting up online in a strange way. And often people substitute for themselves. Other people turn up and they may not even tell the host that's going to happen. Okay, so the host is quite difficult, but the host is quite important. The chair needs to work with the host to try and make sure that the process is as smooth as possible. This is what the chair should do. Chair should always turn up early. Online or in real life, should turn up early, make sure everything's set up and working. Then that's not always easy to do because sometimes the chair isn't controlling the meeting, it's the host controlling the meeting. So even simple things like that don't always work. Must remember that the chair is always trying to get this consensus. Okay, it's really important that the team make a decision. It's not the chair to make the decision. But equally, the chair has to challenge the experts. Yeah, and this is where this conflict starts to arise about, is the chair an expert in themselves, or are they just there to control the meeting? We'll come back to that, but it's important that the chair can challenge. Particularly this problem with that won't happen, it can't happen. Most HAZOPs have that at some point, it will come up. Generally, I found that if somebody thinks of it, it probably has happened somewhere in the world. Okay, generally has happened. And this was where inviting the war stories or getting people to explain why they're saying, oh, no, that has happened. It's happened to me. Get those war stories out there. And that actually helps two things. It helps the team move from the norming into the performing phase. It gets people relaxed. Oh, it's okay to tell about when things went wrong. And that's really an important step in the HAZOP, is when people are feel enough confidence, they feel that they're in a safe area, they actually can talk about mistakes that have happened. It's maybe their mistakes or the mistakes they've seen. But those mistakes are really important to know, because you can challenge the design and say, yeah, but this actually did happen. So is this design sufficiently good to prevent that and similar classes of mistakes happening again? Okay, so it's really useful, this. And this is where the chair really does an important function. The chair highlights these important points and will also encourage the team to generate recommendations or actions. Finally, the other important role, mustn't be forgotten about the chair, is there's a poor scribe who is trying to recall this information. The scribe and chair have worked together, then lots of scribes are mind readers. They actually know before the chair says anything what the chair is going to ask, and they can get about 80–90% of the information down correctly. But sometimes the scribe just doesn't follow the conversation. They is not able to pick up the key points, and that's where the chair needs to give direction. Sometimes it helps to ask the team to give the direction to the scribe. It's not because you can't do it as a chair, it's because it's trying to involve the team in the process. Okay, it's similar to the challenging of the experts. Sometimes you know the answer as the chair. That's not the point. You're not there to show how great you are. The point is to get the team to think about it. So you can ask questions which you know the answer of, but it isn't recorded, it isn't being discussed, and you want to make sure that people are happy that that's still correct. So this whole process of going around the room on issues doesn't work very well online. It's very difficult to do online. It can be done, but it's more complicated. Calling people with specific expertise. You need to know who's at the meeting, and you need to know what they're doing. And if the process of forming, storming, and norming has worked, you're probably in a reasonable position to do that. You can ask direct questions. Again, it's a lot easier around the table than online. And as I said, you can ask members to phrase things for the scribe to write. And that's really quite useful. It does involve people. And clearly, one of the things is clarification. You keep going back until you're happy. But you must be careful you don't get stuck as a chair and going down what's called a rabbit hole. It's something you're interested in, but actually it's not very important. So sometimes you need to be careful that you yourself aren't making things more difficult for the team. And a good scribe will tell you that, and a good HAZOP team will tell you, that's enough, we've discussed it, we'll move on. And that's fine. It happens, so just accept it. Sometimes the team's right and you're not right. The key thing is that the HAZOP chair is not the lead process engineer or the independent process. And you're not the lead instrument engineer and mechanical engineer. It doesn't matter what your own technical expertise are. That's not your job when you're running the HAZOP. Okay. Unfortunately, these days, HAZOP chairs are often put in the invidious position of having to run the HAZOP by actually doing a lot of the work. So in terms of identifying the causes, the HAZOP chair will often go through the P&ID and identify the causes. May actually identify some of the consequences as well, and may actually identify some of the safeguarding. As far as possible, you want to minimize that, but you need to recognize that sometimes in order to move things on, again, especially online, you may need to take that role. A simple trick to help you do that is this. I haven't gone away. You still got to listen to me. It's silence. You sometimes as a chair just need to be quiet, not to say anything. You'll find that when the team is working well, they will fill in the gap. They will fill in the silence. They won't like the silence either. People don't like silences like that, and they will help fill in the process. You just need the confidence to do that, and it will work. So the big question is, how much expertise should the chair have? It's impossible for a single individual to know everything about all the different types of systems that are on a process plant, or all the different processes, or all the different permit systems, operating systems, lockout, tagout systems that may exist. But they should have enough experience to know that these systems exist and understand how they work, and they should have been able to do that in the prep time. Okay. Generally, it's better, in my view, that the HAZOP chairs have actually operated process plant, have actually worked on real sites, and are not just people who know design processes very well. Okay. A lot of the issues about in HAZOP are to do with the operation side of it, how people actually do things. So this understanding of what operations have to do, what maintenance have to do, is really important. And it's getting more and more difficult for young people to get that experience, because automation means we don't need so many people, which is a good thing. So I would encourage people and companies to mentor young engineers through the HAZOP process, get them familiar with it, so that you're not relying on old people like me. You've got young people coming along with new ideas, new insights into the value of HAZOP. And this is difficult, but it needs to be done. And you can see now the industry has always had a very funny age distribution, and particularly oil and gas now has really peculiar age distribution. Lots and lots of people are retiring, and there's sort of a younger generation which are relearning things when they shouldn't have to relearn it. It should already be there. But corporations don't have good memories. So you need to be aware of that again within the HAZOP team. You may have people who aren't that experienced. They might be very senior, but they might not be that experienced. So the challenges within the HAZOP facilitation is you may have the wrong mix of people, you may have the wrong number of people. Getting the length of the debate right is difficult. It really is difficult. And you can go off track. What's a good HAZOP chair? I don't know, really, to be honest. I think you're trying to be objective and honest, and you try and conduct it in an ethical manner. You have to have this high level of energy to drive the process. The HAZOP chair is about the only person who doesn't have any downtime in the HAZOP. You're looking to have a great deal of attention to the detail, but you're also trying to encourage other people. So you have this complex mixture of skills required. So you're trying to get analytical thinking, and you're trying to do the critical thinking at the same time. So to help you do that, you need the help of the team. It's simply not possible for the chair to do all of this single-handedly. You need to help the team to help you to succeed in doing the HAZOP. One way to think about what you're doing as a HAZOP chair is this idea from Daniel Cameron, who Nobel Prize winner, who came up with this idea of thinking fast, thinking slow. And as a model, he suggested that we think in two different ways. Again, that's very appropriate to the way HAZOPs are run. There's the system one, he calls it, where you're in automatic mode. A bit like you drive to work in the morning, you leave your house, you leave your home, you arrive at work, and actually you don't remember anything about the journey. It's not because you've been unsafe, it's just that your brain's taken over control and you've managed to do the whole journey and you've arrived there. But if you thought about it, you probably can't remember the whole journey off by heart. The second way of thinking is system 2, where the mind is in a slower analytical mode. You're reasoning everything out. It takes time. It's a simple example in the book, which I want to show you now. Bat and ball together. How much does the ball cost? Most people get it wrong. Okay. First time round, not everybody, but lots of people get it wrong. Okay. And that's because the natural mode of thinking is system 1 rather than system 2. Think about it, you can work out the answer. It's a model. It's just a way of thinking about the way that as a HAZOP chair, you are thinking yourself. There's not a good way, a bad way of thinking of it, really. But you need to remember that you need to be aware that you as a chair and a team may go onto automatic pilot mode. And therefore they're not thinking about things very carefully. And that can be particularly difficult at the end of the day, after lunch, the HAZOP's gone on, if it's hot, people will tend to revert to automatic mode. And sometimes you don't want them to be there. You need them to come back into the analytical mode, and you need to help them do that. So what do? Well, you need to listen. You need to get a feeling of what the team is feeling. That's almost impossible online. Around the table, you can get a sense when people are getting tired, when they're getting frustrated, when they're getting annoyed. Even in the performing stage, those emotions still come through. And sometimes it's just a good idea to stop the HAZOP. You get to the point where you just think, actually, everybody's getting tired. I'm getting tired. We need to take a break. Now, that can frustrate the host because the host may be in the meeting and is worried about completing the HAZOP on time. But actually, it's sometimes better just to do that. And you need to be assertive enough to do that. To be honest, most HAZOP teams are quite happy to finish early. They're not so happy to stay late. But again, the counter side is sometimes it's actually sensible just to finish something off is to stay late and get that done. So that's the general biggest part of the job is running the HAZOP. Clearly at the end, the chair, not the scribe, the chair is responsible for the report, the HAZOP report. Needs to check it for accuracy and consistency. Often large HAZOPs will have notes in them or holes in them, and they need to be cleared off. You need to make sure that the actions actually make sense, that they are smart. So that's important, that somebody who's not been in the HAZOP can read the HAZOP action and understand what it means. So it's got to be specific, it's got to be measurable, it's got to be achievable, it's got to be relevant to the issue at hand. And it can be timed, if possible, although lots of HAZOPs these days, timing is driven by the project, so timescales are not so important. The other thing that the chair should try and do is issue the actions as soon as possible, ahead of the main report. It simply gets the project able to look at the actions and make sure that they actually make sense to people. And you can use that period to get clarification as well. And again, I've never had a problem in asking for clarification. And go back to the host and say, I need some extra information. And then they're more than happy to give that to you. The HAZOP report must be complete. It must include all the drawings, the marked up drawings. If there's been marks up during the HAZOP, they need to go in. And then, of course, any relevant presentations need to go in. The document needs to be as a whole. I've talked a lot, and I'm trying to give you a flavor of what the role of the HAZOP chair is. If you want to know more, Ristech are running a course on HAZOP leadership. It's a certified course. It's quite a grueling course. It lasts 4 days with a test at the end of it. But it does give you a safe environment to practice the skills that I've talked about and to see what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And if you're interested, you can contact RiskTech to find out more. So to conclude, I think I've tried to give the impression that the HAZOP chair is responsible for this safety outcome and its understanding of the system design. But that's coming from the HAZOP chair's state of mind. That's because that's what they want to achieve. It may not actually be written anywhere. They want to challenge the design, make sure it's fit for purpose, and also make sure they've identified things that can go wrong and a suitable mitigation in place. This goes back to this idea of chronic unease, which was in the last webinar series, and all HAZOP chairs suffer from this chronic unease issue. What motivates them, it's what gets them to ask the questions. The leadership role is uncomfortable and it's difficult and it's complicated, but it's also enjoyable. It enables you to learn new things, stretch your technical knowledge. So there's the hard bit of it and there's the enjoyable bit. Fundamental to all of this process, though, is the HAZOP process needs to be supported by the company who's organized the HAZOP. They need to be committed, because although the HAZOP chair and the scribe is a resource and it costs money, the main resource is actually all those people who have attended. If you've got 15, 20 people spending several weeks in a HAZOP, that's an awful lot of resource to tie up. So they really need to be committed to the process, and they really need to be committed to closing out all these actions. That's really all I want to say. Thank you for your attention and bearing with me. I think it's now time to move over to the question and answers.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Mark. Really good that. Okay, so we got the chance to answer the questions that have been coming through, which I've just got up in front of me here. So the first one is actually a comment from Michael. I think it's when you were talking about Flixborough and he mentioned about location of control rooms. Michael suggested it may have also had to do with being sited close to the facility due to the pneumatic control systems which were originally used back in the 60s and early 70s.
Yes, it could well have been, yeah. but that's fine, and we've moved a long way from there. If you look at modern plant, the control rooms are often in bunkers, and these days obviously we run offshore platforms and there's nobody on the platform, so life has moved on.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got a couple of questions around handling certain situations. A question from Anandan. How do you handle the occasional bully in the room? And we've all come across them, haven't we, in workshops?
Yeah, the bully is a difficult one. So often the bully is the person who is least confident of their own ability. So what they're trying to do is in effect show off. So often you can get to the bully by having a break and having a private word with them, and explaining how their behavior is being not helpful. It's very difficult because it rapidly becomes very personal, and you need to avoid that at all costs. If it comes to the point where you can't get through to the bully and the bully keeps doing it and is very disruptive, as chair, you have every right of the HAZOP to stop the HAZOP and get the host to remove that person from the HAZOP. That's only happened to me once at a HAZOP in Kazakhstan, where we actually did stop the HAZOP, and I actually threatened to leave, get on a flight home and go home. That sort of worried the host a bit, and they removed that particular individual from the HAZOP. So in the end, you are the chair, which is why I've used the term the chair. It is your meeting, and you have the right to say, well, if I'm not going to continue the meeting if that person stays. And sometimes you just have to do that. You may never be invited back to run a HAZOP for that particular organization again, but you've got to make a decision. If you take the HAZOP as a serious process, which I do, then you need to actually stand up for yourself and say, I'm not prepared to be subject to this behavior.
Okay, thank you. A question from Daniel. And I think it's probably a more common situation, and that's how do you control and manage when there's just too much debate?
You need to summarize the debate. If the debate is because there's uncertainty, you say, right, we'll take that outside the meeting and you raise an appropriate action. And generally that normally works. Summarize, raise the action. The action may be something like, blah, 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 is to go investigate the issues surrounding this thing because the HAZOP team did not have enough information to reach a conclusion. Now, that's not ideal, but it stops the debate and it says you regard it as an important subject and you want to take it forward, but it needs to be done outside of the meeting.
Okay, a question from Zuldiz. I guess this is the opposite angle of too much debate, and that is how do you make attendees contribute to the workshop? I guess the people are just not piping up.
Yeah, that's actually more difficult than there's too much debate if when people don't contribute. And this is where you switch mode. And as I said, sometimes the HAZOP chair is forced to start identifying the causes and the consequences and the safeguards. But again, you can use this silence trick. So you may do a little bit of it, and then you may explain that the process involves a brainstorming exercise to identify all the causes. You don't know the process completely. You need your help, and you just need to keep at it. Eventually, it will twig. People will start to join in and get enough confidence. A lot of it is not because they don't know, it's because they're a bit concerned that they may look silly. They may make an obvious mistake in front of their peers or their managers. So you just need to help them build up this confidence. And this is all about this storming, norming, performing part of the process. Get them to the point in the norming phase where there's not arguing anymore. And what they're trying to do is say, no, this is your HAZOP, guys. You need to help me. And you keep going over that over and over again. And usually it does happen.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions around online HAZOPs now. And the first one from Samit. And I think this question, he wrote this question when it came up when you were talking about challenging people as the role of the chair,
yeah,
and also kind of encouraging people to talk to bring up some war stories, and also challenging the problem of people saying, oh, so, it's never happened here before, so that doesn't apply to us. So has he got any tips for how he might be able to handle those type of situations during an online HAZOP?
Yeah, it's a lot more difficult online. You can still use the war stories. You can use your own war stories as a chair. Again, you have experience. And even if you're not the person who's experienced that particular story, you will have a sort of a portfolio of stories that you will use, and you should develop those anyway through your career of things that go wrong. And the other way to do this is actually to go through the consequence bit and say, look, this is the consequence escalates away. Ignore the safeguarding. I mean, this is why people say it won't happen, is because in their heads, they've already decided that the safeguards are sufficient. So you need to emphasize, no, I'm not interested in, for this bit of the HAZOP, following the process, go back to the process of what a HAZOP is, focus on the consequences and say, I want to look at the consequences, assuming there are no safeguards. Just go with me, guys. Assume there's no safeguards. What's the consequence? Once you get that done a few times, they tend to stop, unless by mistake, saying it won't happen. But you need to capture the first one very early on, and then go and remind them this is without the safeguarding. Then we'll do the safeguarding, and then we look at whether the controls are sufficient.
Okay, thank you. A question from Michael. Any thoughts on pre-populating worksheets for virtual HAZOP studies? Perhaps the extent of pre-population, any advantages or disadvantages you see in this approach? And it's a very, very similar question to that from Chioki as well.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, that. I have noticed over the last year and a half, I have started to pre-populate more than I ever thought I would. Now, what I tend to do is only pre-populate the causes when I'm going through the P&ID and looking for valves in the wrong position, lines open when they shouldn't be, instrumentation not functioning in the way it shouldn't be. And during the HAZOP itself, I still talk through that brainstorming bit with the team, and I often leave a few out. Even though I know they should be there, I'll often leave gaps to make sure that they're still engaged. I don't tend to pre-populate the consequences because usually they're quite easy to identify. And I very rarely, if ever, populate the safeguards. I think the safeguards belong to the operations, the design team. They're the ones who tell me what safeguards they've got in place. So I'll do the causes to some extent, but I generally don't go any further than that.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to add my own question in here, actually, because you know, we talked about some of the challenges of online or sort of virtual HAZOPs.
Yeah.
I guess the sort of acid test is, you know, in your opinion, does that negatively impact the actual quality of the HAZOP output? Are you more likely to actually miss something in the design that is significant?
Yeah, this is just back to this chronic unease issue, isn't it? I don't know. HAZOPs aren't perfect. They can't be because they involve people. So even the best in the HAZOP in the world, you're not going to catch everything. Are you going to miss something really important online? Yeah, I think there's a good chance you could miss it. I didn't originally when we started all this online stuff a year and a half ago. I thought it should be okay, but actually, as I've done more of them, I've realized that you'll miss it because people lose attention. So something will be accepted in system one thinking, and you as the chair don't catch that happened, and it just goes through. And so I think you could miss something. But the advantage of online is you have more time to do the review process at the end to check the HAZOP, and you need to give it more time. So you've got this chance as a chair to come back and say, oh, I've missed that. I'm not sure I believe what we said in the HAZOP. I'm going to go and speak to the host to verify it. And then you write something in the report. And I've definitely done that. And I know some other mistake chairs have also done that. They look at it and think, I'm not convinced by that answer, and then come back. And I think again, you're just relying on your professionalism to say, actually, I think we missed it. We need to make sure it's captured. The good thing about the chair role is you have that every right. As the chair, you're allowed to put chairman's actions in. You don't have to justify those. You know, traditionally, the chair can write their own actions. They just put it in and say, this is why I've done it. So yeah, I don't think online HAZOPs are as good as face-to-face HAZOPs. I know some people disagree with me on that.
Okay, a couple of questions around risk ranking then. Sue comments that risk ranking is often contentious. Who is responsible for assigning the severity and likelihood? I mean, assuming a risk matrix is available. And
right.
Can the severity really diminish when the safeguards are taken into account? I guess that's the question around assigning a rating without safeguards and then with safeguards.
Okay, so that's a good question. And in these days, many HAZOPs do the risk scoring, and you're quite right. Risk scoring is horrendously contentious, and it's very distracting for the HAZOP team. The safeguards do not, in general, affect the consequence. And that's true. There are occasionally where you reduce the volume of something by the safeguard, and therefore you don't have the inventory, and therefore the consequence itself is diminished. But by and large, except for those examples of reduced inventory or increased distance, the consequence remains the same. Okay, and the safeguard really affects the likelihood of the event. And that's the key thing. Now, if you're doing a HAZOP followed by a LOPA, you actually don't need to worry about the likelihood of the event. All you're really interested in is the consequence without the safeguard, because that's in the LOPA process, the consequence drives the target mitigated event likelihood, and then the LOPA does all the maths to tell you how likely the event is. So if you are going to do HAZOP and LOPA, try and get in the terms of reference not to do the likelihood in the HAZOP, just get the consequence scoring done. And that removes some of the contentiousness as well, because the risk matrices are generally simply enough that you can see from the matrix whether you've killed one person, more than one person, you've polluted the environment, etc., etc. You've destroyed £100 million worth of asset, and generally that's easier to get down in the HAZOP. Whereas when you get the likelihood event in, it just gets rather silly sometimes in HAZOP. So you're better off not doing it if you can.
Okay, thank you. And then the related question, of which you've kind of partly answered with that answering the previous question. So a question from Sergio. He was asking about pointers to reduce bogging down the team during risk ranking, and you've touched on that there. But he's got an extension. Have you seen any organisations who, I guess, assign in risk rankings to match QRA results?
So the QRA information feeds into the level of the consequence, because the QRA obviously has done the event trees, and therefore that's the consequence. I wouldn't take anything more from the QRA except, oh, well, the model is, we've done the dispersion modeling, the gas cloud will form and it will blow back over the plant, and therefore we can assume that there will be a vapor cloud explosion. And you say, okay, well, we'll take that as the ultimate consequence. But anything else to the QRA, I don't generally bring into the HAZOP. That's not really very useful. Also, QRAs to most people don't mean anything. The numbers don't mean anything. So you're better off not getting diverted down that line. Just think about the consequence and stick to that line of thinking.
Okay, just about 4 more questions, and then we'll finish up. And these are all kind of around the role of the chair. So, should the chair be? Sorry, a question from Talal. Should the chair be involved in the HAZOP recommendation closeout? That's the first part of the question.
Mm-hmm.
Should the same chair be used for the LOPA? And please elaborate good practice to maintain the level of independence as per 61508. For example.
Right. Okay. That's quite complicated.
3 parts there.
3 parts to it.
So recommendation closeout.
Recommendation. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So recommended closeout. Now, in the old days, when I started all this, the chairs were normally involved in the closeout. They would be asked to review the closeout provided by the process engineer, mechanical engineer, and then say, yeah, I'm happy to sign that off as the chair, that they actually addressed the issue raised in the action and didn't go off and do something different. That's become less and less common. Generally, the HAZOP chairs don't get involved in that these days. The last one I did was a couple of years ago in Aberdeen, when we were asked to go in and review the action closeout and sign them off. But that's very unusual these days. The second part of the question was the LOPA. So yes, if the HAZOP chair is qualified to do LOPAs, then it makes sense for the HAZOP chair to run the LOPA, because the HAZOP chair can produce the scenarios from the causes identified in the HAZOP and the consequences. He can aggregate those into the scenarios, which are then going to be studied in the LOPA. So it makes sense for that to happen. And the third part of the question, Steve, was what?
Ensuring independence as per IEC 61508.
Yeah, so generally companies like Ristech are the independent. We're not associated with either the operator or the contracting side, so we are independent. And generally we are involved in the revalidation side of the HAZOP. So we may produce the original HAZOP, and then often we won't be invited to do the revalidation one afterwards. And that gives you some independence. So it does happen, but it relies on the client to make sure. And then sometimes they'll say, no, we can't use him or her, but we can use somebody else from your organization. It's just to give you that independence. And that's fine. And that actually makes a lot of sense. And as a HAZOP chair, you should be happy to say that. And no, I can't do this hazard because I did the early one and it's a revalidation and I'm too involved in it. So I don't feel comfortable to do that.
Okay, thank you. 3 questions just to finish off then. Question from Harry. Is it, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what this is getting at, but is it general good practice to follow the guide words throughout the HAZOP? I guess there's a question around the,
okay,
the extent, or can you skip some?
Yes. So once you set your basic set of guide words up, you should stick to those set of guide words. Because if the guide word's not relevant, you just have to say no issues identified or not relevant to the node. But you stick to the basic set. And then in individual nodes, you can add additional guide words if it's useful for that node. Okay, but stick to the core. It shows that you're being methodical. It shows that you're following the full recording process, which is important these days. So get your core guide words out. They are going to be applied to every single node, even when they're not relevant. You're going to say that. And then if you need additional ones, add those additional ones for specific nodes.
Got it. Yeah, very good. Question from Chioki. I think you kind of answered the previous question, but is it compulsory for the HAZOP chair to be independent of the design team?
It's not compulsory, but it's good practice.
Yeah. And the final question from Babatunde. Can you briefly highlight how the HAZOP leader can do a QA/QC on the HAZOP report before sending it out? So what's the expectations on the leader?
Okay, so there's a simple thing of reading all the actions and make sure they're actually in English or whatever language it's going to be in, but make sure they actually make sense and they address the original issue. So the best way to do that is write the actions out and get somebody else to read them and see if they can understand them, because the action needs to be standalone. It needs to explain the cause, why the action is being raised, what consequences it was trying to address, what's it being asked to do. So get that done. Then you need to go and simply spell check the document. I mean, at HAZOP, doesn't matter the best scribe in the world, there's going to be lots of spelling. And then you need to clear up all these holds I mentioned, where you put notes in, go through those. And then you need to sit down, read through the HAZOP and make sure there's no obvious mistakes. And that just takes time. As you get practice, you get better at it. If you get it in Word, you can do word searching and it will tell you that there's clearly some nonsense has happened. But you just need to allow time in your budgeting for the review of the HAZOP. And you should, if you can, and you're not too tired, review each day's work in the evening before you finish, and then set up for the next day. And that would also allow you to say, oh no, we didn't record this properly. I can get clarification before the HAZOP team forgets the reasoning. So it's a good idea if you can, and you're not too tired, to do it in the evening and do a quick scan through to make sure that you're happy with the content. Don't worry about the spelling, but just the content. Does the information there look right?
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. Okay, we covered off all the questions there, ran over our time a bit, but I thought it was worthwhile doing that because there's some great questions coming through there. I learned quite a lot there.